that sort of leads us into one of the final, I think it's the second to last time we jump back in time. But we basically have the two dignitaries, Cassell and Thandeka, starting to work together while they're in prison and realize that there's a comm link nearby. And they kind of do one of those classic, handcuffed together to like bump something and move it closer so one of them can grab it. And basically start spamming, it seems like a bunch of random noises through the comm link. And the Jedi notice this and say, like, this could be either an error or this could be someone doing something intentional. But either way, this is the first like piece of communication that we know that we can triangulate, and basically use that to start tracking towards the location of the two hostages. Then back in the present timeline, we have Orla and Comac who've now sealed the Drengir back in by the Force, are moving through the station and then come back to the airlock where they're confronted by Haig, who takes a shot at them. And I think Orla does one of the almost like Kylo Ren moves and like freezes the bolt so they can move out of the way in time. And Haig, basically, they confront Haig on the fact that Haig is a Nihil, and Haig uses a radio to sort of inform the rest of the Nihil that this is where they're at. And at the same time, sort of Affy, having heard that the Nihil were going to be attempting to board the Maxine station, has made her way back there and is above and doesn't really realize that Orla and Comac are down below, but knows that the Nihil are attempting to board. And she has a thermal detonator with her and throws it at the airlock to blow it up and sort of stop them from boarding, which basically leads to a huge fight. Different points, they're all cut off from each other and having to sort of save each other. But the Orla and Comac sort of spring into action and start fighting the Nihil. And at this point, Leox sees that this has happened and knows that it's time for him to bring the vessel around and dock the ship so that everyone can escape. And so Affy, at this point, knowing that they're going to try and all get off the Maxine station rather, runs off to find some final data. We have Comac reconnects with Reith, who had been sort of down below and has brought Dez back up. And so you have this moment of them realizing that Dev is still alive. And after that, sort of Orla goes off to search for Affy, with Leox then docking and also heading off to search for Affy and making them aware that there's a huge solar flare that's about to hit again, and it's bigger than the one that happened earlier in the story. And Reith, having a little bit of understanding of how the ship works, decides that he can sort of save the day and run down to the ship's control and try to either increase the shields to protect the ships on the other side or expand the size of the shields. In doing so, he sort of successfully does that, but has this moment where he runs back into Nan for the first time, and basically confronts her on everything that, their conversations they'd had before. And she gives him a little bit of exposition around the Nihil and does give him a chance to escape, since sort of she had saved him, or he had saved her earlier in the story. And basically, like, if you don't take this opportunity, like, we're going to call it even, and I can't do anything for you after that. So he is like, sure, I'm doing that, and bails back to sort of the vessel crew and the Jedi. And at that point, Reith realizes that the Nihil have, made the same assumption that the Drengir and Amaxine had, that this ship can be used to sort of launch parties to different worlds and be used as sort of an invasion or raiding tactic. Leox, at the same moment, has now gone to find Affy, who's still looking for evidence, that her parents had died there, and basically has come to the conclusion that, yeah, her parents had tried to use the same thing to boost around the world quicker to save fuel and make deliveries faster. But Leox at this point is able to convince her that the Nihil are here, the Drengir are here, like, this is no longer going to be used by the Bind Guild. Like, all is lost kind of in this moment. Let's get the heck out of here.
Yeah, this is a whole huge action sequence, I feel like, of various things happening. The main part that stood out to me, though, was the Nan encounter again. Like, I'm bitter about her. She really screwed Wreath over. I'm glad that she let him get away, but she did make some points of like, I learned about the Jedi from you, like, and kind of threw that in his face again too, which I just think rubs a little bit more salt in the wound on this. And then the solar flare for the second or third time in the book is just like one more example to me of how this is like the Oregon Trail out here, and there's about 1,000 different ways you're gonna die on the frontier, and you're like, I'm waiting for one of them to die of dysentery soon.
Yeah, I kind of left that Nan and Wreath interaction feeling like we're almost guaranteed to have these two characters cross paths at some point down the line in another book. I do like that we kind of had the origin story of that rivalry in this book. It feels like she's a good opponent for him, given, you know, again, how crafty and conniving she is. But I did like also that she shows a little bit of honor by letting him go in exchange for him saving her life. I thought that was cool, like complexity to her character.
Yeah, I think given their like younger age and then what they did learn from each other, there is this weird, like rivalry and almost like respect in some regards to what happened, that the fact that they let each other live and whatnot. So definitely, an interesting reunion that we got, but also not like it wasn't like a showdown. It happened in a way where like she was waiting for it to join up with some other Nile. They're coming that way, and he was trying to get the heck out of there. And so it was not like a dragged on, fight sequence or anything like that. It was really just like they had to confront each other about what they'd done to each other, and then Wreath had to bail.
Yep.
We then sort of move into sort of the conclusion of their time on the Amaxine station as they're all trying to escape. And Orla and Wreath connect up to each other as Wreath's sort of heading back to the ship. And Orla's come up with the idea that they could pit the Drengir and Nile against each other if they release the Drengir. So together they sort of remove the barrier to set the Drengir free once again and kind of bait them towards the Nile, knowing that the Nile will use gas and start shooting at them sort of just blindly, which in turn turns the focus of the Drengir from the two Jedi onto the Nile and causes this huge fight to break out, which allows for Orla and Wreath to sort of escape the area. At that point,
this is that moment they messed up.
Yeah.
This will eventually come back to bite them in future books.
Yeah. At this point, you learn that Leox is ready to roll. They've got everyone on board. But because the Drengir have awakened, some of the plant life has started to grow further and further, and it's growing really rapidly. And some vines have basically started to take over the vessel ship. So Wreath decides that if they're sort of going to be trapped there, or if the Drengir are going to consume everything, he wants to go down and launch all the pods that are remaining on the ship so that no one could use this to sort of take over worlds, and basically selects a bunch of just random places throughout the galaxy, knowing that these pods will either be lost to space or get hit by asteroids or other stuff, and that there really be no way to sort of recreate this ancient technology to use it to sort of invade other worlds in the way that the Amaxine intended, the way that the Bind Guild had sort of lost lives trying to use to travel faster, and then the way that Drengir and Nile were now fighting over. As he's sort of heading back to his ship, he realizes that he needs to find a way to save his friends, and basically kind of has this moment of clarity in regards to the Kyber Arc riddle that Jorah Mali had set before him, realizing that you can walk over the arch alone, but the arch wouldn't have sort of been created without the sacrifice of other Jedis, that sort of crystals had been fused together to build this arch. And so that you really can't do it alone, because it takes, sacrifice to create this arch to be able to cross it in the begin with. Which leads us into our final sort of flashback piece with Orla, Comek, and Laret. And they basically find the hostages and come in to free them. But because of Orla's sort of Jedi training, she doesn't immediately go after Isambard when they sort of confront them. And the Force is basically telling her to go after Isambard, but her training tells her, not to strike first. And Isambard gets one shot off towards Thandeka, but Cassel sort of dives in front of her and takes the shot, killing him. So they are able to sort of defeat all these captors and save Thandeka, but Cassel's lost. And that is sort of where we see some of the initial seeds being planted in a young Orla to sort of go down the Wayseeker path, having seen that she should have listened to the Force and not sort of her Jedi training. And if she had done that, no lives would have been lost. This is where we learn a little more, like Josh had mentioned earlier, that the Hutts kind of had set all of this in motion, and that their intention was that Isambard's directorate group would be wiped out, which would basically set up the Hutts to control the Outer Rim as the sort of gangsters of the area.
Yeah, I really hope we see more of the Hutts, particularly in this series. They just, as they've demonstrated here, are pretty tactful and strategic in a evil way. But I could see them being really a good kind of third villain after the Nile and the Drengir for these Jedi during this High Republic series.
Yeah, the gangster thing is always important in Star Wars. I feel like that's the right undercurrent to have.
Yeah.
I do feel like the whole moral to the story of the 25 years earlier is that the Jedi Code fails them. It's kind of what they're going for there. And I think Comac is realizing it simultaneously in modern times, whereas Orla was realizing it 25 years earlier. And that's why she's already on this path.
Yep.
Yep.
So now that sort of the history of those characters is concluded, we get to sort of the final escape of the Amaxian station, and Reeth, having sort of recognized that the Kyber Ark is constructed of sacrifice, realizes that he might need to sacrifice himself to save everyone else on board, and decides to open a giant airlock that basically runs at a portion throughout the rest of the station, with the intention that he's basically going to suck all the Drengir and Nile that are feuding onto the and hopefully all the plant life and some of the vines out into space to let their vessel ship have a chance to escape. He tries to hang on to a ladder sort of as this is happening, but eventually the ladder breaks and he's sucked towards the airlock. But as he sort of gets to where the airlock is, it closes and he hits a closed airlock door. And he looks up and realizes that Geode, the sentient rock, is at the controls of the airlock and has somehow closed this door and saved his life.
I'm now much more intrigued as to what Geode's shape actually is, because I just don't see how he could have done it in the way that I envisioned him.
Yeah. I expected at some point, and when we're close to the end of the book, so I don't think it reveals anything else, but I expected at some point we get that classic, this character doesn't talk, and then the final hour says something, or communicates in some way. But no, Geode, every time one of the main characters looks at him, is just completely still, and they comment to it of oh, don't give me that look or something like that. But it is just a rock that somehow has saved Reeth's life in this crucial moment.
I did think it was cool that they mentioned that in that moment Reeth could understand him. He said so. It was also a growing moment for him within the Force.
Yeah, and there is a moment earlier when they're all running onto the ship and Reeth's going off to do this, that Comac comments that he felt a dark shape ran out of the vessel or moved past him in the doorway of the vessel, and that he sensed life was around him or something, fleeing the scene or something. And so it was clearly Geode running to sort of get a sense of what Reeth was up to. Because the Drengir have now been sucked out of the ship and are dead, the sort of vines they caused to grow have died, and the ship's able to break free. And then Dez, having sort of trying to recover from being sort of tortured and abused and controlled by the Drengir, has some wounds that they don't seem like they're lethal, but he seems not to be recovering from them at all. And then Leox goes to a spice stash and sort of uses some of the leaves to wrap around some of his wounds and like cover his head and stuff with them. And pretty quickly it sort of has an instant effect on Leox or Des rather, who starts to sort of come back to life and spark a little bit up more.
Yeah, it was a good tie back to the medicinal line
Yep.
earlier in the book from Leox.
He was right. It was in fact medicinal. We then return back to Coruscant for the final time with these characters. And it's another one where it's sort of the characters are off on their own after sort of disembarking the vessel. We have Affy, who confronts her mother on sort of everything that she's learned from the data pad, as well as she's found on the ship. And her mother acknowledges it all and basically says in time, Affy will come to understand and accept it. But Affy is not okay with this because even if they stopped doing this, that the amount of time until, the servants would, indentured servants diminish their time, or by the time Affy took control in several decades, that's how many lives might be lost from some risky attempts to reduce time. So Affy actually takes the evidence she's collected and turns it into the Republic, who basically arrest her mother and some of the others involved that they have evidence on, which basically dissolves the Bind Guild in a sense. And based on just like law around how that happens and ownership of things, they determine that the sort of highest ranking member of a ship at the time is granted ownership of it, which because Affy was sort of the underneath Scover Bind, in turn now owns the vessel. But she chooses to retain Leox to captain it, and Geo to navigate it. And they basically now have their own independent cargo ship.
And maintains the name of the vessel.
Yep, and maintain the name of the vessel.
Yeah, I thought this was a cool payoff for the story. I didn't really know where Affy would be, whether she would actually make that choice to turn Scover in, but felt like this was a big, huge choice for her character, and was glad to see that crew, her and Leox and Geo, be together at the end, and have to think we're going to see more adventures from them in this series going forward.
Yeah, that was my assumption, that this vessel crew will now be sort of coming and going from some of the stories we'll see in future High Republic stuff. Reeth, alongside sort of Orla and Comac and Des in a sense, even though he's sort of recovering from his injuries, are having to go in front of the Jedi Council, and they aren't punished sort of for the disobedience that they did. But they do sort of get a little bit of praise for their heroism and sort of the actions that they took being sort of noble. But they are very much told, do not do this again. Like what you did had a good outcome, but it walked a gray line of whether we allow it or not. Reeth, we learn from him speaking to Des that Des sort of his the mental strain and damage he took from the Drengir has kind of broken his connection to the Force. So he's going to be doing what they call the Barash Vow, which is basically a long meditation to go and attempt and heal his connection to the Force. They say that this is could be years. So now we have this person that was just going on adventure to adventure that is going to be on this isolated meditation for several years. And that even within those Barash vows, that sometimes it never really fully heals your connection to the Force. So it'll be interesting to see if Des makes an appearance in some of this future High Republic stuff, kind of as this damaged Jedi in a sense. Sort of his seeing that Des's dedication to being able to pivot from sort of the life he'd had to the life he now has to have, and the dedication he has, that kind of convinces Reeth to follow the wishes of his master in terms of exploring the frontier. But to do it in the way that makes sense to him. So he approaches Master Comac and asks him to become his master, since Comac was going to be going to the frontier to archive that. And so they have the same interests, and it kind of, not only satisfies the wishes of Jorah Mali to have Reeth be exploring outside of Coruscant, but it also embraces sort of his strengths by studying under someone that sort of has the same path of the Jedi as him.
I thought it was cool too that Comac basically says you will be my greatest teacher.
Yep.
In this, you know, like that there's kind of that pivot point, which I do think is like the way of martial arts as well, that like in order to be the best student you have to become a sensei sort of. And like I think that was a neat moment for Comac, in addition to Wreath. And also they're on this like spectrum of like Dooku to like Rael Averross to Qui-Gon Jinn, like of how they feel. And Comac makes a pretty serious point of saying that he doesn't know if he believes in what they're doing anymore, and that he questions it completely. And kind of the positivity of Wreath is what gives him some assurance that maybe we'll figure this out together, which leans them a little back towards the Qui-Gon side of that versus the Dooku side, but it could continue to be an influx thing in future books, I think.
Yeah. And another interesting part too is that Comac says that he's going to be his first Padawan, whereas like we know that Comac's older, and especially coming off Test of Courage, like we had, you know, a very young Jedi taking on their first Padawan, saying like, well, you're going to take a Padawan at some point, might as well start now. Whereas here we have someone that's probably 3 times older, you know, than
good point, actually,
has now taking on their first Padawan. So I thought that was an interesting, another one of these things where it opens up the lore of the Jedi, and the like, it's not just warriors that become master, take on Padawans, and then get a seat on the council, that they do really have these specialties and don't sort of follow the same path as each other.
Yeah, that's a great point. I really hope we see Des again. I was kind of surprised at the conclusion of his story in this novel. I did find it interesting. I think this is the second time in canon we've had mention of the Barge Vow. The first was, I believe, in one of the most recent or more recent Vader comics. Vader actually has to go take out a Jedi who's taken the Barish Vow in order to construct his saber after Revenge of the Sith. So I thought that was a cool tie-in to the comics, and really curious to see what they do with Dez's character. I would assume we get him back at some point in this series or the next few years.
That's by far one of my favorite comics of the recent era too. Like, if you haven't read that, go read that one. We'll have to figure out what issue number it is and throw it up on here, but it's really cool.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I think I'd be interested to see, how Des comes back, whether they bring him back as like this kind of like, you know, broken Jedi that's been able to build himself up, and maybe he has a different approach to the way he, you know, follows his path going forward, or if he's never really able to like reconnect and could become like bitter or something like that. And you kind of have this like fallen Jedi, you know, character that develops out of him, especially because when we first met him, he was this like super nice, you know, charismatic Jedi.
I could see him being used as a resource against the Drengir going forward, because he spent that time in captivity. Maybe he has like this connection with them and can help battle them better.
Moving to sort of the last characters here is Orla, who is basically now ready to start her Wayseeker journey. And so she has purchased a ship of her own to travel the galaxy in. And then we get a little bit of conversation between Comac and her, sort of acknowledging their past and sort of their recent adventure, and allowing her to sort of leave to go on her journey of the Wayseeker. And I think this is where you've kind of, in the flashbacks and with this, you've kind of had the sense that they have this past in connection with each other, but Comac still questions the fact that she's leaving sort of the Order in a sense, become the Wayseeker. But I think at this point now sort of understands and embraces, you know, the decision that she's made, as well as Orla having the opposite, you know, always questioning whether she should be leaving it, and now being fully confident that like, I need to explore, you know, the Force and its connection to me, and not just trust the Jedi Order.
Yeah. The only thing I want to note here is that it's mentioned that Geode is the one who helps her pick out her ship.
I think, and Geode helps her get like a good deal on the ship too.
The only last thing I wanted to note with her is that the parallels to Ahsoka, I think, are kind of laid in that. I mean, she even has white lightsabers, and there's definitely a similar kind of vibe to when Ahsoka leaves the Order and kind of goes on her own way. And you do get the sense that just like Ahsoka, like she pretty much chooses the path of the light, and she's trying to follow the Force. So like she's trying to do good. Like she's not really falling away from being a Jedi. I think she's improving what it means to be a Jedi, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. We then kind of have the final two closing beats of the story, which are kind of juxtaposed to each other, which is the opening of the Starlight Beacon, or the sort of launch ceremony of the Starlight Beacon. And we have Reath has traveled there with Comac, so they've actually successfully reached the Starlight Beacon finally, and are there for the opening of it, amongst all the other sort of Jedi that we've been introduced from some of the other books and comics. And then opposing this, we have sort of the final moments of the story where we learn that Nan has survived the Amaxine station and is back with the Nile, and is talking to Martian Rowe and basically about the Jedi, and he's not really faulting her for what sort of they had to go across, knowing the strength of the Jedi. And she's trying to warn him of sort of the Jedi and that they're going to be in this area now. And he's not fazed by that, and in return tells her that the Jedi should be fearing the Nile, and that the Nile will destroy the Jedi. And that is the closing of Into the Dark.
Yeah, it really felt like this is probably, being the third book, not counting the Great Jedi Rescue. They all kind of conclude with the opening of Starlight, and the first issue of the Marvel comic series kind of happens. Well, I guess the first issue concludes with the opening, or the dedication series.
Dedication, yeah.
Dedication event. But I would expect that, the next series of books we see, and the comics are already doing this, but we'll now be past that kind of dedication ceremony and now be into the next phase of the story. But overall, I thought this was another super strong entry into the High Republic series. Love the characters that we were introduced to, and I think with each kind of additional chapter in this larger tale, we're getting more and more kind of richness and insight into where the galaxy is. And I continue to be really excited about how they're pushing the boundaries of the Jedi and the Force, and kind of not being afraid to explore those more. I am very intrigued to see, again, we've talked about this in previous episodes, how do we get from where we are now in the High Republic to where we eventually see the Jedi in the prequel series? There has to be some event or some shift. And I really like your theory, Dan, of like, maybe they just do see a lot of these Jedi turning to the dark side. I mean, that's kind of been a recurring theme, particularly in A Test of Courage and this book, of Jedi kind of being confronted with grief and loss, and being driven to make poor decisions based on that.
Yeah, the temptation is much stronger in this than you'd think, and it's like constantly present in their minds. So somebody's falling, and I think it could happen fairly soon. Maybe even some of the stuff in the comics might have some elements of that already happening. I think this one might have been my favorite, though, so far of the three, just because we spent so much time again with the group. Kind of similar to A Test of Courage, that we got more time, but obviously this was, much more involved of a story. And, we learned so much about Vernestra in A Test of Courage and really grew to like her. I think spending this much time with Reath was even better, probably. We were deeper into his mind and his process, and where Vernestra didn't struggle really with anything, Reath is kind of in a constant state of struggle, which is more interesting. And Comac, I think, is super interesting. So like I really do hope the next book in this grouping picks up Reath and Comac and follows more of their adventure, to me.
Yep.
Yeah, I think one advantage this book had was being the third book of sort of what's been released. So it didn't have to dive heavily into what the Great Disaster was. We already had that knowledge of that. We had knowledge of the Starlight Beacon. We've had a bit of knowledge of the way sort of Coruscant and the world just as a whole functions. So it did allow it to be focused on really more of a direct narrative rather than some sort of larger sort of info dump sequences, which the sequence or the information that was new in this that we did get was really interesting, like stuff like Orla being a way seeker and stuff like that. So I think it did kind of have the luxury that we're already a little familiar with the High Republic one that did make it, the most enjoyable for me as well, where you could really embrace the adventure and the story they were telling in this sort of more isolated group of just these characters, knowing that we already have the background from the other books to sort of fill in the gaps of sort of the world around it, which leaves me really excited for sort of the next wave of books that we'll get in the summer, because I think they'll probably continue this and be able to sort of expand upon these ideas, knowing that we already have this sort of kickstarted look at the High Republic. And I did find it really interesting that each of the 3 books so far end with the Nile, which I think really sets up sort of what the focus of these next books will probably be, in that we had Light of the Jedi end with Martian Rowe having kidnapped Loden Greatstorm. Test of Courage, they're on the hunt for child soldiers to recruit into the Nile. And then this one, assuming, based on the timeline, is post Light of the Jedi's ending, where Martian Rowe is clearly very confident that, they can take on the Jedi, but also showing us that Nan's still alive, because we will absolutely be seeing that character again, which will be interesting to see the arc of that villain.
The other thing we didn't really talk about too much, but I have to think that this has some connective tissue, is the Amaxian technology and technology that the Nile have, relative to hyperspace. And it just seems like there's more to that story, and finding out how Martian and the Santeca, woman that he kidnapped, how they're able to kind of, have access to all this great technology. I'm sure there's something there that we'll have revealed in later books.
Definitely. Yeah, I think so too. I mean, especially with them combining their ships and things like that we learned more about in this one. That feels like it'll be a big ongoing thing.
Totally.
I think the cool thing from here, and maybe just to like wrap us up, there is a pretty big gap until the next book. And there's a lot of comics in between that we'll be talking about and reviewing. But we also now have a lot of time to speculate and theorize a little bit about this world, which we've not really had a chance to do yet. We were just introduced to it, and one by one had books to follow. So I think there's just so many different directions they could take things in, and so many good characters. And I think that's like the most heartening part to me as a Star Wars fan, is that they did a great job of setting up a whole bunch of great characters with rich backstories that I think we'll love for years to come, probably, in these books.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Dan. One last thing that I'll add: this was the first time that I actually read the book and then also did the audiobook, which I would say, if people can obviously afford to do that, I think it was a pretty good experience, particularly, being able to hear all the pronunciations of the various names. And Star Wars and Lucasfilm have done, I guess Lucas Books maybe, they've done a great job consistently with their audiobook recordings. You get music in there and sound effects, and the voice acting is always great. So I would definitely recommend folks check those out if they're able to do that.
Agreed. We got Space McConaughey strong in the book.
Definitely. Don't worry, it's medicinal.
Yep.
All right, everyone. Well, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. And as Dan said, we'll have plenty of content coming out in the coming weeks and months as we dive deeper into this High Republic series.
We are all the Republic.
It's medicinal.